All right, greetings, friends, and welcome to this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. So great to have you along with us this week as we look back on what's been, I think, a really interesting and significant week in Canadian politics. Some important stories we'll touch on. But I think one of the big takeaways from the week, or one of the significant developments, has been the return to the national political conversation of former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. He's got a lot to say about national unity, about our relationship with the United States, and I think it comes at a really important time. So there's a lot to talk about. And to that end, very excited to have our first conversation here this week with a widely read political observer and commentator on Canadian politics. Spencer Fernando is a Canadian writer and political analyst. You can find him at spencerfernando.com. Follow him on X, Twitter, at Spencer Fernando. Spencer, so great to have you with us here.
Good to be here.
Just interesting, as we record this here on Thursday morning, the Prime Minister's making an announcement, the abandonment of yet another Trudeau policy. You've got the story up at your website on the scrapping of the EV mandate. I mean, is this political? Like, is this further maybe setting the stage for another election? Or is this also about just kind of adjusting to some of the realities of the world?
Yeah, well, I think, the Trudeau government had made a bet that, Biden era policies would continue in the US. I think they were obviously betting that Biden would get reelected. I don't think, anyone, even the most cynical of people, could have predicted the way the US would go, deliberately targeting the Canadian auto sector for destruction. And then there is the political aspect. It's unpopular, just like the consumer carbon tax. And I think, Carney's trying to make the economy more productive, and he's trying to reduce political tensions. And the EV mandate is unpopular, and it's not good for the auto sector. So kind of a smart move to get rid of it.
Yeah, I think so. Do you feel like, we are possibly looking at an early election? I know the rumors keep swirling, and I guess in a minority situation, I mean, anything's possible. But do you read that this is maybe the direction the government's going here?
It's really tough to tell at this point. I think there's always a risk. You have power and then you give it up for an election. There's always a risk of losing it. The polls look pretty good for the Liberals right now, but again, I think there's, we saw the 2021 election, somewhat similar situation, country facing a crisis. Trudeau was quite far ahead in the polls. Thought, okay, we'll go to an election, I'll get a majority. Didn't work out for him. Basically, replicated the 2019 results almost perfectly. So I think I don't know if it's really about an election, but about just reducing tensions in the country, trying to foster more national unity, and again, making the economy more productive. A lot of Trudeau-era policies were very, very dependent on the world staying the way it was, Canada being in a very secure position, Canada having good trade relations with the US, and that's just not the case anymore.
Yeah, that's the thing. I mean, obviously, the Trump shadow looms large, and I know that there's the temptation maybe for the Liberals to use that to some political advantage. But I think at the same time, especially given, and we can talk more about the tone we heard this week, of course, from former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. There is an opportunity here, isn't there, to really kind of bring the country together and to really back up the rhetoric with action when it comes to, really trying to bolster and build up the Canadian economy.
Certainly, I mean, you look at defense spending, right? It was basically impossible to convince Canadians to increase military spending. People thought, oh, who's going to attack Canada? How could we be at any risk? And now you have the government basically trying to catch up to public opinion on military spending because people want to see a much more secure Canada. So I think similarly with economic issues, right? It's basically impossible now to go and say, okay, we're going to sacrifice years of economic growth for an environmental policy that may or may not have a benefit for the environment, 20, 30 years down the road. We still obviously have to worry about the impact that our policies have on the environment, but it's just a luxury we don't have right now. We're trying to save auto sector jobs. We're trying to save the economy. And I think there's much more of a crisis-driven mindset for the Canadian people, which is obviously filtering down to the government, and it creates a lot more room for action.
Yeah, definitely. And there's a lot of economic angst out there, which I do think, the Conservatives have tapped into previously. Let's talk a bit about Pierre Poilievre, though. Of course, he comes out of the Conservative convention in Calgary with a pretty resounding mandate for his leadership from party members. The party's facing some challenges clearly still, and there's that double-edged sword of where Pierre Poilievre really motivates the base. He's really done a lot for the party, but perhaps struggling to grow beyond that. Just your thoughts, first of all, on the position the Conservatives find themselves in, and maybe some of the lessons perhaps they've drawn from last year.
Yeah, well, they're in a very tough position, I think, partly because of how flexible Mark Carney has proved to be, right? It's Trudeau was a very good political opponent for Pierre Poilievre because Trudeau would always dig in his
Absolutely.
heels, right? The more unpopular the carbon tax became, the more Trudeau wanted to defend it, almost out of some sort of sense of ego, like, oh, I'm not going to give in. Carney's very different. He's just, okay, it's gone. The what was it? The capital gains tax increase that became unpopular, got rid of that too. Now the EV mandate, digital sales tax or digital sales tax. And so there's just a lot of policies where the Conservatives, they score a lot of political points on the Liberals, build up a lot of political capital, and Carney says, okay, I'll give you what you want. And then the issue is basically gone for them. And sure, you can say, oh, well, it happened because the Conservatives did this. And it's true, give Pierre Poilievre credit for shifting public opinion in many cases. But politically, it doesn't really matter that much because Carney's the prime minister and he's the one making the change. So ultimately, most voters give him the credit. They also have a tough situation because, precisely because Poilievre is so popular with the base of the party, but really struggling outside of it. It's very tough for him to make any changes because any changes he makes upsets the base. But if he doesn't make changes, then he can't become more popular among the general public. And then, of course, there's the Trump factor, which I'm sure we're going to get into, but that also, causes some issues for the Conservatives.
Well, it does. And I know you wrote about it for the Hub, urging Poilievre to take this head on, to be more direct than he's been. I think it's almost like they feel like if this is in the news, it helps the Liberals. So let's talk about other things. That almost seems to be kind of the impulse that the Conservatives have right now. But there's no ignoring this, right?
Yeah, it's similar to how the party seems to be saying, okay, we'll just wait for the NDP to recover and then we'll be fine. You're totally giving your agency away, right? Well, maybe the NDP won't recover. Maybe the new leader will push more people on the center left to the Liberals. Not that there's many more who could go there with the NDP at 6%, but you make a good point that Trump can't be ignored. And ultimately, I think, it's obviously Poilievre is in a tough spot, but a big part of leadership is not just following your base, but also persuading them. And, I watched Stephen Harper's speech last night, and he did quite a lot of that, where you could see him, he would acknowledge, okay, we can't blame all of our problems on Donald Trump, but also Donald Trump is trying to damage and really wreck the Canadian economy. And we can't trust the U.S. as we can before. So, kind of reaching out to the base a little bit, saying, okay, everything in Canada is not Donald Trump's fault, but also saying, look, you can't just pretend he doesn't exist, and you can't pretend the relationship's going to go back to normal. And I don't know why Pierre Poilievre can't really say the same thing. I don't see any reason why he couldn't say something similar to Harper. But he and his people seem to have largely decided, we'll just pretend Trump doesn't exist. And I think the problem with that is the rhetoric that comes from the party because of that looks like it's just blaming Canada for Donald Trump. But when you keep saying, oh, Carney needs to get a deal, Carney's not getting a deal, Canada's not negotiating. Well, we were negotiating, and then Donald Trump decided that he didn't like something Ronald Reagan said that was in an from Doug Ford, and so we're going to blow up negotiations. And I think people realize, okay, if it wasn't that, it's going to be something else. Maybe he wouldn't like a tweet some politician in Canada made, and then he'd say, oh, Canada's our enemy. He got angry when we said we respected the territorial integrity of Greenland and Denmark. Who could have predicted that would have anything to do with trade, right? So at a certain point, they just need to, I think, emulate other conservative politicians who've been successful. Tim Houston has been fairly critical of Trump, Doug Ford, obviously, and now Stephen Harper. I think they all kind of show a path that Poilievre could.
It's interesting to see. I mean, circumstances have kind of brought Stephen Harper back to the forefront with the unveiling of his portrait and, of course, the 20th anniversary of the Conservative victory in 2006. There was a poll out this week that shows Canadians still hold Stephen Harper in high regard. And I think part of it is almost like the Carney factor, right? Where people want a more serious political leader, that serious times require serious political leadership. But to see Stephen Harper come out and not come out swinging necessarily, but with some pretty stark and stern warnings and terms about the threat we face from the United States and that things really have changed, I think that carries a lot of weight.
Yeah, certainly. It's always going to be tough for partisans to hear a political opponent say something, even if it's true. That's a bit of what's happened, I think with some of the hyper partisans in the Conservative Party. They're so used to anything Trudeau says they would oppose. And now Carney is saying often very different things, much more reasonable things, but they're still stuck in the opposition mindset. So when Harper says something not exactly the same as Carney, but fairly similar, it's easy for people to hear. So I think that's important. And I think seeing Carney and Harper at Harper's portrait unveiling, both, giving a lot of praise, Carney praising Harper, of course, Harper being pretty respectful to the Canadian government as well. I think it's important for Canadians to see that. And because we're facing such an external threat, we don't really have the luxury of just saying, okay, we're just going to keep, fighting the way we used to. I mean, if you look back at when Trudeau was elected, he was very much a leader for a time when not much really mattered, right? It's kind of you could take a risk on somebody, and the world doesn't seem too serious, you know? And so I think Canadians are looking back at that time and saying, well, you know, Harper would be someone good to have in power now. Maybe Harper should have stayed in power as opposed to Trudeau. But I think Carney has a little bit of the Harper gravitas and the seriousness. They are similar in some ways, and they obviously worked together in 2008, 2009 during the financial crisis. And so I think that's helpful for Carney. It's obviously helpful for Harper. It's a bit tough for Poilievre because some people might be thinking, you know, was Poilievre more of a Trudeau-era opposition figure who was good for fighting Trudeau, but maybe is struggling to adapt to the way things are now?
Yeah, that's the challenge. It was interesting too, and I think it was important for Stephen Harper to talk not just about Canadians coming together to face external threats, but what we're facing internally. And I hope or I expect maybe that Stephen Harper is going to be more of a voice for Canada in the debate in Alberta. I think he certainly has a lot of respect here in Alberta, certainly amongst Conservatives in Alberta. So to hear him talk this week about how important it is to fight for Canada, to preserve Canada, how important is that right now, do you think?
Well, it's very important. It can't, it just kind of back with what I said about, partisanship. It can't just be left to a liberal federal government to defend Alberta, in Canada, right? That's, maybe they might say things that are correct, might say things that are good, but it's not going to be perceived too well by a lot of people in Alberta who understandably, after, 10 years of Trudeau, are understandably skeptical of the actions of the federal government, right? It takes a lot of time, even though I think Carney's moving in the right direction. It takes a lot of time to rebuild trust that has been broken. And so having someone like Stephen Harper speak out would be quite important. And I think not just because he's well respected in the province and among Conservatives, but I think it kind of gets some of the, hate to use the term, but some of the CPC influencers kind of back on side. Because you see some of the influencers the party promotes a little bit, they kind of sometimes seem pro separation, and then they kind of go back, and like that's not too positive because they have a lot of reach. And so when someone with the authority of Harper within the party speaks out, it kind of gets those people a little bit back in line and on Canada's side.
Yeah, I mean, I get the sense that, the separatist movement in Alberta is almost seen as something disruptive, almost in a way maybe similar to the convoy protests in 2022, or more broadly, Brexit, or the Trump movement, the MAGA movement in the U.S. So the idea that this is causing disruption in Canada, it's almost in a way something to kind of latch onto. But I mean, there's a lot at stake here, right? It's not just about disrupting the political status quo or flipping the middle finger to the political status quo. Like there's very real consequences to all of this. So yeah, it's one thing to sort of flirt with it, or to look at it as it's getting the political elites all riled up, but there is a lot at stake here.
Yeah, and especially with the intervention from the U.S. now, quite unprecedented to see U.S. officials saying, "Oh yeah, well maybe it'll be great if Canada was broken up." That's and again, it's not just it's not a normal administration, right? So it's not like some Biden official going off or an Obama official, even a Bush official, right? The U.S. clearly believes they have total control and should have total control over everything that happens in the Western Hemisphere, that it belongs to them, or I should say the Americas, North America, Central, South America. And they're fine interfering everywhere. You look at how Elon Musk, will threaten a European bureaucrat or something for trying to regulate Twitter, and then JD Vance will go and threaten that country, and then Trump will attack that country, right? It's all very kind of cohesive with the U.S. trying to enforce its will on people. So certainly, I think that's a real risk because the U.S. I think they're going to try to interfere for sure, whether it's through running ads, whether it's through manipulating social media platforms, making massive financial offers during a referendum. And then I think there is a bit of a bait and switch effort with some of some, obviously not all, but some of the people pushing for separatism. It's very much, okay, first we'll appeal to people who don't like what's happening with the federal government. But then if there's a vote to separate, then it'll actually become about joining the U.S. So kind of once you're out, then now we're doing this. And so I think it's quite concerning, and I think it needs to be taken seriously.
Yeah, it seems naive or maybe even misleading to suggest that the United States is going to say, wow, here's this little new independent country. Let's establish relations. Let's give them a free trade deal. Let's help them out, get them on their feet, as opposed to, look, this is an oil-rich, mineral-rich, strategically placed new state that we could exert a lot of influence over. So, I mean, the idea that the U.S. is just going to sort of stand idly by, especially under this president, that's a lot to ask.
Yeah, and I think for those who think that they would become a state, that to me is unlikely. Even assume, I think it's most likely there will not be a vote to separate. Like there'll be a referendum, but I think most likely it'll fail. But the idea that the U.S. is going to say, here's statehood, here's 2 senators, here's some Congress people, and here's full voting rights. No, if that happened, they would make it a territory. We're going to dictate to you what happens. We're going to take all the oil. And again, what's interesting is, again, the concerns about equalization are very understandable and realistic. The U.S. has very similar programs. The most productive and high per capita GDP U.S. states pay a lot of net money to the federal government, which then goes to less productive areas in the U.S. So the U.S. has a very similar system. So the idea that even becoming a state would fix that problem would not be true at all. And Alberta's demographic weight within the U.S. would be about 1.4%, whereas in Canada it's currently, I think, what is it? It's like 12%, and projected to head to between 16 and 18% between now and 2050. So Alberta every year is going to become more influential politically, going to be adding seats every time they do new seat apportionments. And so again, like I get a lot of the frustration, but I think some of the people pushing for separatism are really not being honest about first the consequences and what would happen afterwards.
What do you make of Danielle Smith's role in all of this? I mean, I think she's someone obviously that has some national stature as a prominent conservative. She spoke at the Conservative Convention. I think in certain ways she's been trying to govern as a different kind of conservative. We see with health reform or on taxes where, she's trying to show what conservative government can look like, at least her brand of it. And even I think showing leadership on the pipeline issue and getting this deal with Carney, I think that speaks well to her. She really seems almost afraid of this separatist movement and, sort of almost catering to it to get us to this point. I don't know how that reflects on her, especially as Canadians watch what's happening. Your thoughts on Danielle Smith?
Yeah, I think she's somewhat similar to Poilievre. She's in a tough position, but it's not. It's somewhat of her own making, right? And similar with Poilievre. I think getting the MOU with Carney, that was a big political risk for her. We saw that she was booed at the convention. And so I give her a lot of credit for taking that risk and, trying to put partisanship and regional divisions aside. And, if that does turn into something, that itself could be a very, big blow to the separatist movement, which would be positive. But lowering the threshold for a referendum, you kind of risk getting a little bit into David Cameron territory, right? Where it's like, okay, well, we'll the pressure release valve idea, right? Once you make it easier to hold a referendum and then you kind of hedge your bets a little bit, that you don't know what's going to happen, right? And so that could be very difficult. And again, I think with both, it's easy for me to say as a pundit who's not running a political party, so take that for what you will. But with both Smith and Poilievre, there's a little bit too much fear of their base sometimes, I think. And you want to be the leader of a party, well, you have to be a leader sometimes. And that sometimes means going to the base and saying, look, this, we're going to have to start shifting public perception on this. Poilievre needs to do that with Trump, drive down the Trump support within the Conservative Party. And Smith, I think, needs to make it clear that, look, the UCP did not run as a separatist party. I see people making the comparison with the Parti Québécois or the Bloc saying, okay, well, Quebec has separatists, they run for office, no one's angry about that. Well, the Parti Québécois generally says they're a separatist party. The Bloc says they're a separatist party. So if you vote for them, you kind of know what you're getting. If you vote for a party, that United Conservative Party that says it supports Canada and Alberta within Canada, and then half of that party turns out to be separatist, and then you're kind of the leader of the party, or the party itself is hedging its bets on whether Alberta will stay in Canada. Well, people didn't really vote for that. People weren't aware of that was going to happen. So that starts to become a political issue.
Well, it's interesting to that end. I mean, Jason Kenney's been pretty outspoken about all of this, and one of the points he made is that the UCP was founded as a party that believes in Canada. So, that still needs to matter. And I think to see him, his willingness to take on the separatists, to criticize Donald Trump, maybe he feels sort of unleashed because he's out of politics. Maybe he sees himself back in politics at some point, but he's emerged as kind of a really interesting figure right now. What have you made of Jason Kenney as of late?
Yeah, I've been quite impressed. I think he's someone who, it's funny, people will attack him on Twitter for not being a conservative, because that's the new thing. If you're anti-Donald Trump, you're someone not a conservative, even though Trump is really not a conservative. But I think Kenney's actually, what he's trying to do is he's trying to preserve the actual values of Canadian conservatism and conservatism more broadly as a positive ideology. I mean, you saw that with how he's talked about Ukraine, the war, Russia's war against Ukraine. He's been very outspoken in defense of Ukraine. Same with Stephen Harper, of course. Harper was very pro-Ukraine, which gets forgotten a lot by some conservatives on Twitter. And he's defending Canadian sovereignty against Donald Trump. He's defending free trade, NATO, all these things that conservatives once used to defend and now are kind of under attack from within the conservative movement to an extent. So I think what Kenny's doing is very impressive. Similar James Moore. James Moore has been saying a lot of the same things as well, former Harper cabinet official. And it's interesting how you have people who are very high gravitas officials, very credible officials in the Harper government, who even prior to Harper speaking out have been very tough on Trump, pro-Ukraine, defending Canadian sovereignty. And then you see Harper, come out and speak and say very similar things. So I think I have no idea if there's some coordination or discussion, but it seems like there's certain core values that Harper, Kenny, and Moore are trying to push forward. And I think it perhaps speaks to a concern of, possible fractures within the conservative movement, part of it shifting in the Trump direction, part of it trying to stay true to what Harper created, what Peter MacKay created. And so I think that's an interesting dynamic to watch. And I think it would be in the best interest of all Canadians if the kind of Harper, Kenny, and Moore, path went forward.
Because it gets back to, the point you've written about before, that it's not just sort of the principle of opposing what Trump stands for and what he's done. I mean, there's the political calculation. I mean, Donald Trump is incredibly unpopular in Canada. I mean, he does risk, I think, dragging down the Alberta separatist movement. But I think if conservatives aren't careful, and maybe we saw some of that last year, it can drag them down too.
Absolutely. One thing I write about a lot is you can't, if you're trying to be a national party that needs 40 to 45% of the vote to win, because that's probably what the Conservatives need now, unless the NDP recovers to Jack Layton levels, which so far seems unlikely, then you can't ever be on the 20 side of an 80-20 issue. And Trump is an 80-20 issue, if not 85-15 in Canada. 80 to 85% of Canadians, I'd say, basically despise him. And then 20 to 15% are maybe somewhat open to him. And the Conservatives the problem for the Conservatives is most of that 20 to 15% are within their party. But to be beholden to a group of people who have views on Donald Trump that are completely at odds with the vast majority of Canadians, it's devastating for a political party. And I think you see a little bit of that with, Jamil Jabani going to the States, trying to get a meeting or a deal he talks about. I don't think that's going to look good for the Conservatives at all. And I think, Poilievre, again, he keeps avoiding Trump. He lets kind of stunts like the Jamil Jabani thing go forward. At some point, you kind of need to control your party and take a stand.
Yeah, I know it's one thing. And to Poilievre's credit, he's done this to say, look, if we can help in some way, if we need a united Team Canada front, then let's do that, which I think is positive. But, to sort of have MPs doing their own thing or freelancing, I don't know, that seems risky right now.
Yeah, and Giovanni comes back and he says, well, he's still in the States, but he tweeted, "Oh, I've got a message from Donald Trump, which is, I tell the Canadians I love them." First of all, that's not a deal. And well, you love the country that you say shouldn't exist. Its borders fake. I'm going to make you, surrender to the U.S. through economic pain. I'm going to destroy your auto sector. I'm going to lie about you. I'm going to denigrate the contribution of your troops. Not too loving to me. So I don't think that's going to go over too well.
Well, we'll see where everything goes from here. I mean, obviously, the White House, the Trump factor is an unpredictable one. The political uncertainty in Ottawa with the minority government, whatever's going to happen in Alberta this year with a referendum, whatever's going on in Quebec. I mean, it's shaping up to be a crazy year.
Yeah, certainly we live in interesting times, but maybe a little less interesting would be nice going forward.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, much more is mentioned. SpencerFernando.com. Spencer, it's been great talking to you here. Thank you so much for making some time for us.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, our thanks once again to Spencer Fernando, Canadian political writer, political analyst. You can find him at his website, SpencerFernando.com. You can join the over 100,000 people following him on Twitter, X, at Spencer Fernando. He's a contributor at The Hub as well. We mentioned his recent piece you can find at thehub.ca. Some interesting insights from Spencer Fernando and everything going on in Canada right now. Some really important conversations ahead of what is still bound to be, I think, an eventful and still an unpredictable year. So we talked about Stephen Harper, and I think it's interesting and significant to see Stephen Harper's re-emergence, partly driven by circumstances. There was a big gala this week marking the 20th anniversary of the Conservative victory in 2006. And of course, along with that, there's been the official unveiling of Stephen Harper's portrait in Parliament. But I think with everything going on right now, I think Stephen Harper's return to the public spotlight, as it were, is a very welcome one. And I think, especially when you look at where we're at after 10 years of Justin Trudeau, maybe why there was such a hunger for someone like Mark Carney, someone seen as a more serious leader. I think, as I mentioned to Spencer, I think a lot of that still kind of applies to Stephen Harper. And a poll out this week kind of confirming that maybe Canadians do have the perception of him, both as an elder statesman, as a former prime minister, and a real serious thinker when it comes to public policy in this country. And look, Stephen Harper is not shy about letting his thoughts be known on where things are at right now, both in terms of our relationship with the United States and national unity here at home. So it's interesting to hear his pretty stark assessment of where things are at with Donald Trump in the United States. I think it's encouraging and refreshing to hear his defense of Canada and national unity at home. And I expect, or I hope, that as the conversation continues about Alberta's separation or Alberta's future in confederation, that he's going to be a big voice in that conversation. And I think he's still a voice that carries a lot of sway with people in Alberta, especially those on the political right in Alberta. So I want to let you hear a little bit more of what the former prime minister had to say this week. And look, I don't think he's trying to steal any political thunder from Pierre Poilievre or draw any kind of contrast. I think Pierre Poilievre has a ton of respect for Stephen Harper, served under Stephen Harper, will probably himself acknowledge that there are things he could learn from Stephen Harper. And so I think it's an important tone that Stephen Harper sets here, not just for others in the Conservative Party, but for leaders right across the country. So first of all, let me play this clip. This was the speech that Stephen Harper gave during the unveiling of his official portrait. And again, he doesn't directly talk about Alberta separation, but when he talks about the importance of fighting for and preserving Canada, it seems pretty clear where he's coming from.
I will repeat that. I sincerely hope that mine is just one of many portraits of prime ministers from both parties that will continue to be hung here for decades and centuries to come. But that will require that in these perilous times, both parties, whatever their other differences, come together against external forces that threaten our independence and against domestic policies that threaten our unity. We must preserve Canada, this country handed down to us by Providence, preserved by our ancestors and held in trust for our descendants. We must make any sacrifice necessary to preserve the independence and the unity of this blessed land. As I have said before, le Canada est et a toujours été notre pays. Nous voulons que le Canada poursuive son épopée des plus brillants exploits et qu'il soit aussi fort et aussi libre que possible à tous égards. Le meilleur pays du monde. We all want Canada to be the true north, a true north, as strong and as free as it can be, in every way that counts, the best country in the world. Only then can we say that we have been true to this great country. Friends, you've done me a high honor today. I truly appreciate it. Merci beaucoup. God bless all of you. God bless Canada.
All right, and this was a little bit later in the week. This was the former prime minister speaking at that gala we mentioned, marking the 20th anniversary of the Conservative victory in 2006, turning his attention to the topic of Donald Trump and offering a pretty stark assessment of where things stand in the Canada-U.S. relationship under Donald Trump.
In the past year, Canada has faced a challenge unique in our lifetimes, a hostile United States, one that has openly questioned Canadian sovereignty, that has openly broken the trade commitments that we have made to each other, and that regularly issues further threats against us. As Canadians, we've been understandably shocked, bewildered, and angry. But while these feelings are understandable, it will surprise no one who worked with me to hear me say that we must focus not on emotion, but on policy. The American people have chosen their administration, and that administration is pursuing what it believes is in America's interests. The question for Canada is not how we feel about what the U.S. is doing. It is how will we adapt. Now, friends, I know there are many in Canada, many particularly in the business community, who believe that things will go back to the way they were in due course, with secure and predictable access to the U.S. market and a United States that upholds a global order. I do not believe that is a safe assumption. Rather, I believe that Canada must adapt to new geopolitical realities. To be clear, these realities mean that we must reduce our dependence on the U.S. in order to protect our sovereignty and our economy. But we must do so also clearly understanding that by all the critical measures of international relations, America will still remain our principal partner in the world. Thus, our future path requires balance and sober reflection.
All right, and one more here from Stephen Harper in that same speech at this gala this week, where he talks about how Canada needs to respond to Donald Trump, how Canada, in his view, needs to hit back against Donald Trump. He talks about the need for reciprocal tariffs, which Canada did initially and then kind of backed away from, hoping that might get us to a deal. Clearly, that hasn't happened. But Harper also talks about what Canada needs to do to broaden our trading relationships. And what seems pretty obvious and central to that is building a new export pipeline to the West Coast. Here's how the former Prime Minister addressed that.
So as we approach critical deadlines for the USMCA, I believe there are two things that Canada must strongly defend. The first is our industrial capacity. We cannot allow the obvious attempt to move Canadian manufacturing south of the border. One-way tariffs introduced by the U.S. must be reciprocated. Now, will that, friends, be costly in the short run? Yes. But what we can never concede are permanent one-way economic flows from Canada to the United States. The second thing to preserve is our potential to sell our critical resources to world markets. We cannot permanently become a captive supplier to the U.S. market. Now, friends, that reality was clear to us in 2015, and I think it is obvious today. It remains so, and it's something we've got to do quickly. Yes, that means our oil and gas, but it also means uranium, rare earths, and many other commodities. Canada needs more than a list of major projects. We need to reinstate the reforms our government enacted to streamline the regulatory process and deliver decisions in a reasonable time frame in order to attract global capital. And Canada needs to build critical infrastructure like another pipeline to the West Coast, not someday, but right now. Friends, we need this, both for our economic prosperity and our national unity. There is simply no way to explain to people in my part of the country why a nationally beneficial project is singularly blocked by federal policy.
Okay, so interesting and significant, I think, to hear from the former Prime Minister this week on these issues that are dominating the conversation in Canada right now. I guess we'll see how much more we hear from Stephen Harper in the weeks and months ahead. But look, these issues continue to loom large here in 2026 for the federal government. Some big decisions to be made about how to try to move forward, both in terms of negotiations with the U.S. and free trade talks, but also what more we can do to build up trading relationships elsewhere. And I think Stephen Harper's right. I mean, this is an obvious opportunity to build that infrastructure that will allow us to diversify our export markets. And that starts with building a new pipeline. And hopefully we'll see some progress on that front in the weeks and months ahead. Listen, that's where we'll leave it for this episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Again, our thanks to Spencer Fernando for joining us, spencerfernando.com. Much more at his website, much more at our website, robbreakenridge.ca. You can find us on YouTube. And of course, you can find this podcast on your normal podcast platforms. Have yourselves a great weekend, folks, and we will talk to you next week. Take care. Hey, folks, thanks for watching and listening. You can find us at robbreakenridge.ca. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button below and stay connected with the Rob Breakenridge Show.